Welcome back. I'd like to introduce our second speaker today. This is Doug Scott. Doug received a bachelor's degree in pharmacy from the University of Cincinnati and then went on to get a PhD in pharmaceutics from the University of Maryland. He worked at Procter & Gamble for 26 years in the RX and OTC drug divisions, doing upstream technology development, including ingredient identification, formulation, drug delivery, and process development. Particular areas of focus for the formulation optimization involved technical, biological, and sensory and experiential performance. Then he added to his degrees and got a little degree in brewing science from the Midwest Culinary Institute. Since 2018, he has been working as a consultant in the area of experimental design and optimization, with a primary focus in the development of new beverages based on sensory science. Doug has been a great, strong advocate of DOE for over 30 years and has implemented it in so many settings. So we would like to welcome Doug to our 2023 online DOE Summit. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Sherry. It's a pleasure to be here. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Let me put it in presentation mode, okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here and I'm happy to participate. What I'm going to talk about is some work I've been doing the last 5 or so years in the development of alcoholic beverages and using DOE, and specifically where the measures are sensory attributes and preference. And what I'm going to show you is a number of different modeling approaches that I take to try to figure out what's going on, because with sensory data, as was mentioned earlier, it can be quite complicated, particularly if you're talking about preference. Let's see here, I'm having problems moving to the next slide. I'm locked up.
Try just
oh, there we go.
Say, click on it and then use your mouse. Usually works.
Okay. Sherry already introduced me, so I won't go through this in any detail. The one thing I will point out is that when I first started at Procter & Gamble in the early 90s, this is where I was first introduced to the Statige products. And back then there were actually 2 products. I'm old enough to remember that, Design Ease and Design Expert. And they've since been rolled into one. So I've been a long time user. And then I worked in the over-the-counter business after being in the prescription business. And the majority of my career was in the oral care technology division, which worked on upstream formulation and ingredient identification of things like toothpaste, mouthwash, denture adhesive, etc. And that's where I really learned about holistic product design, because not only does your product have to meet all the technical criteria, but it has to have a great sensory experience. Otherwise, the consumer's not going to purchase it again. And then in the over-the-counter business, you know, that's the name of the game, is getting people to buy your product over and over. And then, as mentioned, I went back to school and got my degree in brewing science, and then started working as a consultant. And my primary client is a brewery here in Cincinnati where I live called Mad Tree Brewing. So my life is great. I get to do DOE in a brewery. It doesn't get much better than that. As referenced earlier, there's lots of challenges with sensory studies. So it's worth talking about that. Number one, the data is inherently variable because you're using humans as your instrument and they're grading on a scale. And then hedonic measures, which are measures of preference or liking, they're the ultimate subjective measure. So it becomes very difficult to try to assess and model someone's preference when preference can be so varied. There's all kinds of experiences in life that some people love and some people dislike. We also need to limit study legs to avoid grading fatigue and tasting sessions. That was mentioned earlier as well. Because your humans are your instrument, they can only taste so many samples before their sensory acuity starts to drop off. And because we want to study as many factors as possible and we're limited on number of legs, we sometimes need to sacrifice replicates or lack of fit points. And then sometimes, more often than you would like, you just have to accept less than desirable data. That's just the way sensory data is. But I'm a firm believer that there is truth in the data, and it just needs to be sorted out without fooling oneself. But at the same time, you have to keep your mind open to unexpected results. So when you put all this together, sensory analysis really is quite challenging. But in the end, you really need to assess the risk-benefit ratio of using these leaner designs where you have minimum legs, and then having to deal with the occasional messy data set. I asked the question here, what's the worst thing that could happen in my case? Likely, if my model doesn't fit very well or as well as I would like, I'm still going to end up with a very good product, but it may not be the absolute optimum in the design space. I feel that's a pretty low risk. The kind of work we do in the brewery is predominantly new product development. And there are two stages of work we do. The first I just call the exploratory stage, and this is where we do the bulk of our work. And we do serial DOE, and we use trained employee sensory panels as our measure. And for these kinds of studies, we need good direction setting with reasonable prediction. We're not looking for real fine prediction. We can also be more liberal with statistics and models, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through the data. We also want a really good understanding of the flavor system. We're not just looking for an optimum. We want to know why an optimum is an optimum. Of course, it helps to understand the given product that you're developing at any one time, but what you learn for one product, that can apply to future products as well. And then coming out of that exploratory stage, we move into the final selection stage. And our goal is to have 3 or 4 prototypes coming out of that exploratory stage that we then test head to head. And we will do this in a broader employee pool, so going beyond the trained sensory panel. And then we can actually do studies in real taproom patrons. One of the great things about working in a brewery, if it has a taproom, is you have actual consumers coming into your facility every day. So we can very easily set up a flight of small servings of beverages, just like you would get a flight of beer or whiskey or wine. And the taproom patrons, they love to participate in development of a new product, and they get to try new and different things for free. So it works out quite nicely. Again, the brewery is Mad Tree in Cincinnati, Ohio. And to date, we've done over 100 individual DOEs, and that was done in about 5 years. And we've done sensory optimization on all kinds of beverages, beers, ciders. We did this one study on a mixed drink that is served in the tap room. And then the last couple of years, we've been focusing a lot on these RTD cocktails, or ready to drink cocktails. But we've done other non-sensory work too. For example, focusing on the brewing process, mash efficiency, which centers around extraction of sugars and starches from the malt, and grain milling and fermentation and those kinds of things. Okay, a little bit on these ready to drink cocktails. You're probably very aware that in the last 3 or 5 years, that alternatives to beer have become very popular. So you've seen alcoholic seltzers, alcoholic sodas, and teas like twisted tea. And then there's this other class that are called ready to drink cocktails that use some kind of alcoholic spirit as the source of alcohol. And a lot of them are vodka based, because vodka is very neutral and very easy to add flavors to. The particular product I'm showing you here is a variety pack called Sway. That is Madtree's brand name for their vodka cocktail. And this particular execution is called Pool Party, and it was launched at the beginning of the summer, and there were 4 different flavors in this variety pack. And the great thing about these ready-to-drink cocktails is that they're very simple formulas and they're easy to prepare, so they lend themselves very nicely to DOE. You can turn them around very quickly and do, serial DOE in a pretty timely fashion. And the particular flavor variant in this variety pack that I'm showing an example of in this presentation is this product here in the red box, the watermelon mint variant. Here's the design. This was a second study in serial DOE. We had come out of a first study where we were studying more ingredients, I think 5 or 6, and we narrowed in on these 3, watermelon, lime, and mint. Lime is an important ingredient in this composition, even though it's not part of the flavor name. You can see the ranges we studied here. So these 3 were varied as a mixture. And then we also have a numeric variable here, total load or total flavor load. So up here, we're varying the composition. And then with the total load variable, we're varying the total amount of a given composition that we're putting in the beverage. And this particular design was a KCV design, like with the chocolate chip cookies. Also a split plot design where each tasting session had a fixed total flavor load. And all subjects were intended to assess all products, again, in an employee sensory panel. So each employee, replicated the experiment within themselves. Here's the design and the layout. You can see we have 20 runs. And there are 4 groups. So the groups are the split plot part of this design. And each group is a tasting session. And within each tasting session, there are 5 products. And you can see that we're varying the composition, but the load is fixed. And the reason we did this was to avoid sequence effects on the subject's ability to grade. And specifically, we were worried about somebody tasting a high load product or high intensity product, and then following that with a low load or low intensity product. So we were worried about after tasting an intense product that their sensory ability might be hindered a bit and that they might not be able to adequately taste the following low load product. So that's why we fixed the load in each session to avoid that. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to doing this. We decided to do it in this study, and it seemed to work out just fine. Again, as far as KCV designs, Mark talked about them in the chocolate chip cookie presentation earlier, and I'm a big fan of these designs. And as he mentioned, the whole point of them is to be minimalistic designs, to minimize the number of runs, but still get information on all the linear effects or main effects, and then all the interdependencies of all factors, so all interaction terms. So above, I've got a screen grab showing the terms that are included in this particular model. This is the full model that was designed for. So we've got the linear mixture components, which have to be in the model. And then we've got all the paired interaction terms for the mixture components. So AB, AC, and BC. And then you see 3 terms involving D, 1 for each of the mixture components. So AD, BD, and CD. So that picks up the load by mixture component effect. And then there's a D squared term, and in this case to pick up curvature for total flavor load. Great designs. I'm a big fan of these. We had 15 responses, and they were graded on a 0 to 7 point scale. And we do commonly simultaneous hedonic and attribute grading. The hedonic measure is preference. So if they give it a 7, they love it. If they give it a 0, they hate it. And we have 7 aroma attributes and then 7 flavor attributes. And these focus on overall intensity, the 3 flavors, alcohol, aroma, and taste, which are important. People generally don't like to taste alcohol or smell alcohol. A little bit's okay. Artificial aroma and taste, those are the main ones that we have in nearly every study. And then depending on what the flavor system in, we'll throw in some other relevant measure. In this case, we had sweet aroma and tartness. A quick comment on how individual subjects grade. They each have their own grading style. And what I'm showing here is how each subject in the study, there were 10, graded the products they tasted. And I don't want you to study this in any detail, but I just want you to notice that some people grade over a very wide range of the scale. Some people grade over a narrow range. And then like the second person here, again, they're in the high range, but they grade, you know, or they're in narrow range, but they grade in the high end, and then other people grade in the low end. And because of those different grading habits, I find that if I'm using individual data points and not using means, if I block for subject, this really helps to account for differences in the use of the grading scale. It really does help the statistics. Okay, so let's get into some actual data. The first thing I do is just look at all the legs in the study, the means, independent of the original DOE. So I just look at these as a single categoric variable, like a pairwise comparisons exercise. And I do this just as a first look to see what kind of spread there is amongst the individual products. So was the study flat and they graded all of them similarly, or was there some spread? And in this case, the mean preference ranged from 2.5, the poorest performing, up to 4.1. So over a range of 1.6, which might seem pretty narrow. However, you have to remember this is the second study in serial DOE, and ideally we have honed in on a more optimal region. And then the other reason I do this is because I use mean values to then, you know, model as originally intended, as a function of the factors. So that brings us to our first model. Again, this is the mean model. So all subject scores for each run are averaged, and then that is modeled. So all the results I'm going to show you in contour plot form are set up like this. I've got the 3 mixture components as a ternary contour plot. I've got a graph on the left, or a plot on the left at low load, and a plot on the right at high load. So this gives us a visual snapshot of the whole 4-dimensional design space. So the first thing to notice here is that anything with high mint in the composition has the least preference. And then the other thing to note is that there is no load effect for mint, right? If I have a composition with high mint and I put it in at low load, I get about a 2.8, and then I put it in at 6 times that level and I get the same preference. It doesn't go up or down. So that's very curious. Why is that? We'll get to that. You'll see that I focus on mint a lot in this presentation because it's a problem ingredient. So I'm giving you I'm kind of spoiling the whole presentation by telling you that. The optimum in this case is circled in red up here. So this would be a watermelon heavy product. So it would be a 70-20-10 watermelon lime mint composition at low load. Here are statistics for this model. And you can see generally the model is significant. My p-values here look good. But then I have this AD term in here with a p-value of 0.17. And this gets to what I was saying before about being more liberal with statistics and models. I don't want to be too conservative and throw out some good information that might be helpful. And then the other thing is, I'm not going to use any one modeling approach that I'm going to show you to make a big decision off of. So it's okay to look at models that have, non-ideal or marginal statistics. The other point here, though, is if I don't include this AD term, then I don't have any representation of total flavor load in the beverage. And I find it hard to believe that load wouldn't have an effect. If you look at the R squareds, for those of you that are used to working on really nice, well-behaved data sets with great measures that are very accurate and precise, these may not look very good, but they're actually not too bad for sensory data. We do get studies where we get R squareds of 0.8 or so, but that didn't happen in this case. This data set wasn't, as well behaved as we would like. And it's in part why I'm showing you this data, because it's difficult to analyze. If you look at the predictive versus actual, you can see there is some fit, but of course there's some scatter. So you wouldn't want to use this model for fine prediction, but it's fine for our purposes. Okay, a second analysis I do, and I mentioned this earlier, is instead of using means, I will use all individual points and then block for subject. And in this model, we get similar results in that anything with a high mint fraction is least desirable. There is a little bit of a load effect here, about a half a unit or so. But the optimum in this case shifts to a higher line product. So this would be a 50-40-10 watermelon lime mint, but again at low load. So when I see the mean model and the individual points model not agreeing, you have to ask yourself the question, why is that? Is this telling me something? And if you thought I was too liberal with model acceptance and p-values with the mean model, you may think I'm crazy here. But the overall model looks significant. I've got a BD term here with a p-value of 0.17, but I've included this CD term with a p-value of 0.28. Now, I really don't like a p-value of 0.28. However, if I take CD out, then BD becomes insignificant or has a p-value of about 0.3. And then I don't have any representation of D again. And I find it hard to believe that load would not have an effect. So I decided to go with this model. We did not have significant lack of fit. You can see I'm highlighting the R squareds, which are absolutely abysmal. And the predicted R squared is actually negative, which is usually a bad thing. But our signal to noise ratio is good. So we've got like this mixed bag of results here. If you look at the predicted versus actual, you can see there's tons of scatter. Now we're using individual points here, and there's nearly 200 points making up this fit. And knowing that we're trying to model preference, it's not a surprise in this example that these R squareds are really poor. Now, I purposefully, in this analysis, ignored groups because I wanted to show the worst case that we have to deal with sometimes because we don't often do split plots. We don't have the groups. But if it makes you feel any better, if I include groups, I essentially get the same model, or I do get the same model, the same terms, with essentially the same p-values, but the R squareds are improved. Okay, a third approach, and this is focusing on drivers of preference, not preference as a measure. And this is where the preference data is modeled in of itself. Specifically, preference is modeled as a function of sensory attributes. So this ends up being just simple multiple linear regression. And I'm showing the results here in the form of a perturbation plot. If you're unfamiliar, the x-axis is a normalized axis. And in this case, we're going from the low level, and I use the grading scale 0 to 7 here, the low level of an attribute to the high level. And then the nexus point here is 0, which is the middle of the scale, 3.5. And this is a great way to see all the drivers of preference and their direction in one plot. So for example, if you look at the purple line here, which is watermelon taste, if we start with low watermelon taste and increase watermelon taste, our preference goes up. So watermelon taste is a positive driver of preference. In contrast, if you look at this gray line here, which is factor N, artificial taste, if we have low artificial taste, our preference is high. And if we increase artificial taste, our preference goes down. So that makes a lot of sense. So again, this is a great way to look at all of the drivers of preference, and you can see, the magnitude and direction. So like, what are the biggest drivers and whether they're positive or negative. The other great thing about doing a drivers of preference analysis, we can do optimizations based on just drivers of preference, not preferences of measure, where we maximize positive drivers and minimize negative drivers simultaneously. So it gives us an opportunity to identify more potential optimums to explore. So in this case, the positive drivers of preference were mint aroma. Keep that in mind. We're focusing a lot on mint. Sweet aroma, watermelon taste, lime taste, and tartness. And negative drivers of preference were artificial aroma, which makes sense. People don't like artificial things. Mint taste, okay, mint taste is a negative driver of preference, but mint aroma is a positive driver. And then alcohol and taste were also negative drivers, which makes sense. The other interesting thing about this particular drivers of preference analysis is that 9 of 14 attributes were important. They were either statistically significant, highly statistically significant, or practically important, which is unusually high. Normally, 4 to 6 attributes can reasonably describe preference, but in this case, it took more. So there seems to be a lot going on in this particular data set. So let's take a look at some of the specific individual attributes. So here I'm showing contour plots again, and this is watermelon taste. I've circled in red here where the highest watermelon taste exists, and not a surprise, you put more watermelon flavor in your composition, you get more watermelon taste. Now that might seem obvious, but that doesn't always happen, because flavors are very interesting in that when you combine a given flavor with another flavor, it may display differently than what you might expect. But in this case, seeing something explainable is nice, because it gives you some faith that your sensory panelists are able to pick up something that makes sense. We see the same thing for mint aroma. Compositions with high fraction of mint have the highest mint aroma. But note here that there is no load effect. So that's similar to what we saw with preference in the mean model in particular. So very interesting. And then we see the same thing for mint taste. So why is that? I hypothesize that mint is overwhelming at high fractions. If you have a composition with high mint, and then you put more of that composition in the beverage, you're not detecting more mint. So you're saturating the subject's sensory perception of mint. And that's important to note, because oftentimes if you are putting more of something in and not getting more of an attribute, you could be getting more of a bad thing, because flavors can bring both pleasant experiences and unpleasant experiences. And that brings us to artificial aroma. So in this case, watermelon flavor, high fraction of watermelon, brought the highest aroma. So that's in contrast with watermelon taste, which was a positive driver of preference. So you can see we've got, you know, competition in attributes within a single flavor in this case. And then when we look at artificial taste, we see that both watermelon and mint can bring high levels of artificial taste. So compositions with higher lime have less artificial taste. So lots of competing objectives in here. Okay, so those are the first three analyses that I typically do on any experiment to just get a handle on, you know, what's going on. So let's take a look at what the optimums we've gotten so far from these three analyses. So for the mean model, if you recall, the optimum was a 70-20-10 watermelon lime mint at low load. It has a preference of 3.9. The individual points model shifted to a higher lime product, still low mint and at low load. And then when we do the drivers of preference optimization, again, where we simultaneously maximize positive drivers and minimize negative drivers, we get two optimums. And the first one here is the same composition as the mean model up here, but at a middle load, middle of the range. And then the second one is similar to the individual points model, except that it has a little higher mint fraction, but also at a middle load. So you might be thinking, you know, this is a pretty lousy data set. That was my initial thought as I was analyzing it. You know, we've done 3 different models here and we've got 4 different potential optimums. Now, when I do this analysis and all 3 of these basically tell the same story, I'm happy because, you know, that's an indication that the data set is pretty solid and it's consistent within itself. But if they differ, I'm still okay with that because remember, our goal is to identify multiple optimums that we then put in a final experiment and test head to head. One quick comment on the absolute scores here. They're not as high as we would like. Normally at this stage, we like to be at least a 4 and ideally higher, up 4.5 or 5. But we know that polarizing ingredients and polarizing legs in a study can drive down overall scores across the whole design space. So poor performing legs or polarizing legs can have a negative halo on the better legs. So we're not too concerned about that, at least at this point in the development process. Okay, so digging deeper to try to figure out what might be going on here, I do another analysis, and this is again preference as a measure modeling, but now subjects are included as an actual categoric variable, so not just block for. And now each subject can have their own equation, and this enables prediction of individual subject optimums. And then additionally, it allows for identification of potentially polarizing factors. I'm suspicious that there is polarization going on. And specifically, we look for interactions that involve subject. So in this case, our new factor or additional factor that we've added is factor E. So here are the stats for this model, and now this starts looking pretty good actually. So the overall model is significant. The linear mixture portion is very significant. The AD term, so that's the watermelon by load term, is included like in the mean model, but the p-value is 0.13. I'm not going to get too upset with a p-value of 0.13 for data like this. And then there are 4 terms that all involve E or subject, and those are highly significant. So this is an indication that there is a lot of difference between how subjects, you know, are grading all of these products. So this is an indication that there is some polarization going on. We do not have significant lack of fit. Our R squareds now look a lot better, and at least our predicted R squared is not negative. And our signal to noise ratio is good. And when you look at the predicted versus actual plot, yes, there's lots of scatter, which there's going to be because there's nearly 200 points making up this fit, but you know, it looks much better. So including subject does seem to improve model fit. And then, as I said, when you do this exercise, you can then predict optimums for each subject. You fix the subject and then maximize preference. And what I'll do is create a table with every individual subject's optimum. I don't want you to look at that in any detail, but what I'll do is just kind of tabulate what I see going on, see if this helps me understand a little bit more. So for example, 6 of 10 people preferred high watermelon. So that was kind of split between high and low. 7 of 10 preferred lower lime. 8 of 10 prefer the low mint. So generally people don't want high mint. And only one person prefers the highest mint. And then total load was kind of split. Now, the ingredient, you know, of interest here is mint, as I've mentioned. It has its own unique sensory character and kind of sticks out like a sore thumb amongst watermelon and lime. So I was interested in what the absolute mint concentration was, the optimum for each individual subject. So we can actually calculate that very simply by multiplying fraction by the total load. And when you do that, we see that there's a wide range, in fact, the widest possible range of preferred absolute mint levels for each subject, ranging from as little as 10, the lowest, up to 24 times that at 240. And then there's a couple of people in the middle at 60 and then one at 120. So again, I'm becoming suspicious that mint is polarizing. Okay, so if you have a polarizing system, how do you go about finding a single formula that's going to please as many people as possible? So I do this optimization that I've named the one formula to rule them all optimization. That's a Lord of the Rings reference, in case you didn't get it. And this is where subject-specific equations from the individual subject model that we just talked about are used in a new model. And each subject's equation is entered as an individual simulated response in this new model. And then numeric optimization is performed where you maximize preference for all subjects simultaneously. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail on how this can be done, but just so you know, there is the ability in Design Expert to copy any model formula out of Design Expert, and I paste into Excel. And because we have subject as a factor and it's a categoric factor, and there are 10 subjects, there are actually 10 individual equations, one for each subject. And then I will copy those from Excel and then enter an equation in as a response. And then if you enter an equation in, there's a way to do that. The cells are automatically filled in. So that's done for each subject. And then we can tell the software to optimize preference for everybody as best as possible simultaneously. So when we do that, there are two optimums that come out of that exercise. So what I'm showing you here is each individual subject's acceptance of these two optimums. So the first optimum is the same as the mean model, the 70-20-10 at low load. I've got a horizontal reference line here at 4 because I define that if I have one formula to rule them all, that I got everybody at a 4 or very close or higher. So you can see with this composition that didn't happen. There's really only 5 people. There's 2 here and then 3 here that were at about a 4 or higher. So 5 of 10 would be, pleased. The others, there's a few that got close, and then one person that would probably not be very pleased. The other optimum that came out of this is similar to the individual points model. So this is a 58, 32, 10 watermelon and lime mint at low load. And you can see that in this case, there's only 6 of 10 people that we got close to a 4 or higher. So is there one formula to rule them all? No, at least not out of this exercise. So there's really no formula that even pleases the greater majority of subjects. Now we can look at any composition this way. So here are the other 2 potential optimums from the drivers of preference. So this is the 70, 20, 10 at middle load. And you can see when you take that composition up to a middle load, then it kind of splits people. There's 3 people that really like it, and then everybody else would be maybe okay with it. They wouldn't hate it. But then this other optimum, which was a 40, 40, 20, so this one had a little higher mint fraction, still in the lower end of the mint fraction range. But again, at middle load, this one has kind of 3 levels of acceptance. There's 4 that would be pleased, maybe 4 that wouldn't be thrilled or wouldn't hate it, and then 2 people that would be very disappointed. So out of all of our optimums, there is no one formula that can even please the majority of subjects. So why is that? I've hinted at mint and I've hinted at polarization. Well, one diagnostic plot that really stuck out was the difference in betas plot for mint fraction. And if you're unfamiliar, the difference in beta is, I'll try to summarize what it is real quick and simply. So a beta is the constant in front of any term in the model. So every term has a beta. And so you know the beta for the full model where all points are included. And then one by one, each point is taken out and the whole model is recalculated. And then you compare the new beta to the old beta and see how much it changes. So, and there's some calculations that are done. It's not just the absolute difference. But what we can see here is there's very little scatter at low mint fraction and middle mint fraction. So what that says is down there, you take people's points out and it really doesn't change the model that much. But when you get to the high mint fractions, there are some people, when you take their point out, it changes the model a lot, specifically the model term for mint fraction. So to me, this is either direct evidence or very good indirect evidence that mint is polarizing. Then the other thing to point out, I'm not showing it here, is that the difference in beta plot for flavor load, total flavor load, showed the same pattern. So you just compound the polarization when you combine high mint fraction with high load, kind of what I was referencing before with the absolute mint levels that were optimum for each individual subject. So what I really want to know is, what is the variation in grading amongst the individuals in the whole design space? So a convenient way to look at that is to use a relative standard deviation. So just like we use a mean and then model the mean, we can calculate a relative standard deviation and model that. And wherever the standard deviation, the relative standard deviation is higher, that suggests that portion of the design space is more polarizing because people are grading it, differently, more so than in other regions of the design space. So if we look at the contour plots, we see at low load, yes, mint indeed has a higher RSD. And then when you go to high load, the RSD is higher overall. And not only is mint more polarizing, but then lime starts to contribute. So between this analysis and the difference in betas, diagnostic, and then, we saw the other models really weren't agreeing very much. I think it's pretty clear that we've got polarization going on with, in particular mint, but also load, and then at high load, lime can start to participate in polarization as well. So when you have a flavor system where there is no composition that really is going to please everybody or even the majority of subjects, how do you go about picking one? Well, we went and did our final analysis where we took 4 optimums, or tweaked them a little bit before we put them in the final study, and tested them head to head. And there was one that did well. Well, they all did pretty well, but there was one that did better than the others. I can't tell you exactly what that formula is due to confidentiality, but it most resembles one of the drivers of preference optimums. And you might be surprised which one it is. It's this one that had the 3-tiered acceptance with 2 people hating it. Now, not only did this do well, but there's logic behind why it was selected and why we might have expected it to do well. So number one, the product concept from the very beginning was intended to be watermelon mint, and that was based on flavor trends and other marketing information. So there was information out there that said people should like this. Additionally, mint is on the label. It's actually part of the flavor name, watermelon mint. So if you're going to put mint in, and you're going to say you put mint in, it should be noticeable during consumption. You don't want to just sprinkle a little bit of mint in there to say that you have mint. Additionally, it's only one of 4 flavors in this variety pack, and it's okay to have a somewhat polarizing product. In fact, in alcoholic beverages, polarization isn't uncommon at all. If you think of beer styles, there's 1,000 beer styles, let's say, and there's some people that love all of them, and there's some people that love, only some of them, and they hate the others. So alcoholic beverage consumers, they kind of expect that they're not going to love every product. And then the other thing, and I mentioned this before, we know that preference scores are generally higher outside the context of DOE and employee panel. So these scores really are, kind of depressed. So if you think, if you could move this whole plot up, these 4 people around a 3, they might be closer to a 4. So you really be pleasing 8 out of 10, but there still would be 2 people that would perhaps dislike it. And then in the end, and I didn't even know this until last month, I didn't know how the watermelon mint did over the summer. So I asked the Mad Treat people, how did it do? And they said it ended up being one of the more popular flavor combinations in that variety pack. So that was a pleasant surprise to me, and it makes a nice, ending to this presentation, as a success story for DOE. Okay, so I've got a little problem here. Here we go. Okay, conclusions, and then some thanks, and then we'll take questions. So results were difficult to interpret due to polarization, but I think in the end were reliable. If we didn't know it already, we proved it here again. Sensory data is inherently variable, and that's particularly true for hedonic measures like preference and liking. I believe being generous or liberal, but judicious with model selection is key. However, you need to have knowledge of the subject matter if you're going to do that. If you're doing modeling and you don't have knowledge of the subject matter, then you need to be working closely with someone that does. Multiple analysis approaches were crucial in having confidence in optimum selections and identification of mint as a polarizing ingredient. There was no one modeling approach here that really told the whole story. A comment on using averages. Averages, averaging subject scores, it has its place in sensory analysis. It's a good thing. However, you have to, keep in mind that it's not ideal in representing polarizing study legs. If you think of, true polarization, like if you have a bimodal distribution, you have half the people that love a product and the other half hate it. Taking an average of that is not really representing what's going on there. So if you suspect polarization, be cautious with averaging. And then in the end, the client had more than sufficient data to make a business decision and understood the risks involved with selection of a potentially polarizing product. But in the end, they did a good job. They knew what they were doing, and they were brave and selected a polarizing product. And then thanks real quick to everybody at MadTree. Thanks to the owners who have kept, me working with them for 6 years now. And then the experimental team that I get to work with. There's 4 people that do all the work that I get to work with. And then of course the sensory panel members, you can't do anything without them. And with that, I'll take questions.
Great, thanks, Doug. That was really fun to hear you talk about it. I had a preview of the slides, but hearing you tell the story was a lot of fun.
Good.
Yeah, early on in the presentation, you referred to a term called serial DOE. What do you call, what do you define as, or what do you mean by serial DOE?
Good question. The way I define it is you're doing more than one design of experiments. You're doing a series of them, and then each time you go to the next experiment, you're honing in more on where you think your optimal region is. Now you could also maybe tangentially go off and explore something else or add another variable, but typically what I end up doing in this kind of work is honing in on the design space. So starting wide and then kind of funneling into optimums.
Great, thank you. Another person asked, they said some of the diagnostic plots would tease them into looking at data transformations. Have you explored any transformations with the data? Does it ever seem to help, or maybe haven't?
Absolutely. Oftentimes, I would say with about half of the attribute responses, design experts suggest a transformation, not usually with preference. I'm not sure why that is, but that's been my observation. And the transformations that seem to be suggested more often than not by design expert are either a square root or a power transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, it does help. It in some cases it'll help a little bit, it'll improve the statistics, but other times it'll make a big difference where the difference between the model where it's not transformed and is transformed, it can actually be different. It'll throw a term out or include another term in. So I try not to transform, but if it's suggested, I will try it. And if it improves it, then I will usually accept that transformation.
Yeah, that seems like a great approach. Len noticed that there's a lot of overlap in the graphs for the points, but that overlap in terms of the error bars, those LSD bars were overlapping a
Yes.
little. And it seemed like you talked about that a little bit, but he was concerned that maybe that was an indication that there wasn't much difference between the
Yes.
averages.
So yes, good point. So I think the plot he's talking about is where I just modeled all of the legs independent of the design. So often when I do that, because it's preference and there's so much variability, it'll look like the legs aren't breaking, but you will find certain legs that do break. And there's a big difference between trying to break 2 points from one another versus modeling factor effects. So just because if you're looking at the individual legs and they're not, statistically breaking from one another, that doesn't mean that there's not anything going on and that the factor effects aren't significant. So that is an excellent point. Yeah, because it can make the data look really bad if you just look at them individually, but there you're just modeling the independent points. You're not modeling actual factor effects, which is, the latter is the intent.
Mm-hmm.
We're never intending to break two legs from one another.
Okay, here's a two-part question. I'll just ask the first part to begin with. So our human tongue has a limited number of sensor responses. The responses you presented don't appear to be based on those, like salty, sweet, etc.
Right.
How are other terms defined not based on the tongue?
Okay, that's very good. So there are taste receptors. There are other receptors that can sense things like warm or cool or burning or tingling. And in the sensory world, we do think about those, but so there are scientific, known taste sensations, but then there's the actual subject's perception of things. So a great example is I had sweet aroma as a specific attribute. Well, you can't smell sweet. Like technically you can't smell sweet, but people often, if they smell something, they will say it smells sweet. So we can't tell them, no, you're crazy. You can't be smelling sweet, but that has meaning to them. So there's some, looseness in the definition of terms, and it means whatever it means to the subject.
Yeah.
I don't know if that fully answers the question or answers it adequately. That's about the best I can do right now.
No, that's good comments. The second part of it was he was asking, was there any consideration for using instruments for responses like a gas chromatograph or
Yes.
anything else?
In fact, at the brewery, there was a previous analytical person on our team that we worked with, and they wanted to buy a GC mass spec, but they're very expensive. And it is helpful to do, actual sensory perception, with subjects combined with actual analytical measures. But that ends up being kind of a nice to have for a smaller brewery like this. This brewery has about 100 employees, so it's tough for them to come up with $100,000 or how much ever a GC mass spec costs. So, but we did do one study where we worked with a university and did both preference attribute grading, with subjects, and then had the analytical data to go along with it. So yeah, I wish we could do more of it, but those instruments are very expensive. We're not like Anheuser-Busch or AB InBev or Miller Coors.
All right, thank you so much. Doug, I just want to say thank you once again for your time today. I found it fascinating, and I'm sure our audience did too.